The FBI just received DNA evidence recovered from a Tucson home. According to investigators, this could be the break that finally cracks a case that went cold for over 30 years. The victim's name is Nancy Guthrie, and if the forensic analysis confirms what detectives suspect, we may finally learn who took her. Based on public records and investigative reporting, here is what we know. On February 1st, 2025, Nancy Guthrie was abducted from her home in Tucson, Arizona. The circumstances of that night set in motion an investigation that would span 3 decades, frustrate multiple generations of detectives, and leave a family without answers. Until now. To understand why this DNA evidence matters, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. February in Tucson brings cool desert nights, temperatures dropping into the 40s after sunset. The city sits in a valley surrounded by mountain ranges and neighborhoods spread across a Sonoran landscape in a patchwork of older developments and newer subdivisions. Nancy Guthrie lived in one of these residential areas, a home that should have been safe. The abduction was described in official records as a home invasion-style crime. Someone entered Nancy Guthrie's residence and took her. The specifics of how the perpetrator gained entry, whether through an unlocked door, a forced window, or some other method, became part of the investigative file. What is clear from the public record is that Nancy Guthrie did not leave voluntarily. This was a kidnapping. In the immediate aftermath, Tucson police would have followed standard protocol for a missing persons case that quickly escalated to a suspected abduction. Officers canvass the neighborhood. They interview anyone who might have seen something unusual. They look for witnesses, for vehicles that did not belong, for any disruption in the normal pattern of the street. Detectives process the crime scene, photographing the interior of the home, documenting what was disturbed and what remained in place. They collect what evidence they can find. In cases like this, the first 48 hours are critical. Statistical analysis of abduction cases shows that the likelihood of recovering a victim alive drops significantly after that initial window. Detectives work against the clock, chasing down every lead, following every tip that comes in through the department hotline. But sometimes the leads do not connect. Sometimes the tips point in different directions. Sometimes a case that starts with urgency slowly grinds into frustration. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's abduction eventually stalled. Detectives pursued their initial leads, but none of them produced the breakthrough they needed. The perpetrator, whoever took Nancy from her Tucson home, effectively vanished. There was no arrest, no prosecution, no resolution for the family left waiting for news that never came. The case went cold. In law enforcement terminology, a cold case is an investigation that remains open but has exhausted all active leads. It does not mean detectives have given up. It means the standard investigative methods have produced everything they can produce. The file remains in the system, waiting for something new, a witness who comes forward years later, a deathbed confession, or increasingly in the modern era, a forensic technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. For over 30 years, the Nancy Guthrie case sat in that cold case file. 30 years of silence, 30 years without answers, 30 years of a family not knowing what happened to their loved one or who was responsible. During those 3 decades, the landscape of criminal investigation transformed completely. DNA analysis, which was still relatively new in the early 1990s, became the gold standard for forensic identification. Databases like CODIS allowed law enforcement to compare genetic profiles across jurisdictions, and in recent years, investigative genetic genealogy opened entirely new pathways for identifying unknown suspects by tracing family connections through commercial DNA databases. Cold cases that seemed permanently unsolvable began falling, one after another. The Golden State Killer, identified in 2018 after terrorizing California in the 1970s and 1980s. The Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire, victims and perpetrator both identified through genetic genealogy decades after the crimes. Case after case, forensic science was accomplishing what traditional detective work could not. Against this backdrop, someone in law enforcement took another look at the Nancy Guthrie file. The evidence that had been collected from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home was still preserved. In cold cases, this is often the critical factor. Evidence degrades over time if not properly stored. Chain of custody must be maintained. But when biological evidence survives in usable condition, modern forensic techniques can extract DNA profiles from samples that would have been insufficient for testing in earlier decades. According to sources who confirmed the recent development to ABC7 Chicago, DNA evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home has now been handed over to the FBI. The Bureau's forensic laboratories represent some of the most advanced genetic analysis capabilities in American law enforcement. FBI technicians can work with degraded samples, touch DNA, and other challenging evidence types that might overwhelm smaller regional labs. The specific nature of the DNA evidence has not been publicly disclosed. It could be biological material left by the perpetrator at the scene. It could be touched DNA from a surface the kidnapper contacted. It could be evidence that was collected in 1995, but was never suitable for testing until advances in DNA amplification techniques made analysis possible. What we know is that investigators consider this evidence potentially critical to solving the case. After 30 years, the FBI is now analyzing genetic material that could finally put a name to the person who took Nancy Guthrie. The handover to the FBI represents a significant escalation. Local jurisdictions typically maintain control of their cases unless federal resources become necessary or federal crimes are involved. Kidnapping can fall under federal jurisdiction depending on the circumstances. The FBI's involvement suggests that investigators believe this evidence warrants the Bureau's advanced forensic capabilities. If the DNA analysis produces a viable profile, investigators will have several pathways forward. They can search CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence from other crime scenes. A direct match would immediately identify the source of the DNA. If no direct match exists in CODIS, investigators may pursue genetic genealogy, the technique that has proven so effective in other cold cases. By uploading the DNA profile to genealogy databases and identifying relatives of the unknown suspect, analysts can build family trees that narrow down potential matches. This approach has identified perpetrators in cases where the suspect had no prior criminal record and thus no profile in law enforcement databases. The timeline for this analysis could range from weeks to months, depending on the condition of the evidence and the complexity of any genealogical investigation that follows. For Nancy Guthrie's family, this development represents something they may have stopped hoping for. After 30 years, there is finally movement. There is finally the possibility of learning what happened and who was responsible. For the broader community of cold case investigators and forensic scientists, this case joins a growing list of long-dormant investigations revived by technological advances. Each solved cold case demonstrates that time does not necessarily protect perpetrators. Evidence collected decades ago can still speak. The investigation remains ongoing. The FBI's analysis is not yet complete. But for the first time in over 3 decades, the Nancy Guthrie abduction case has active forensic work being conducted. The file that sat dormant for so long is open again. If you want to go deeper on cases that were never fully closed, subscribe. A new file opens every week.